welcome to MOAD, the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House. Thank you for joining us for the 2024 Henry Parkes Oration. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Stephanie Bull and I'm the director here at MOAD. I would particularly like to welcome the Henry Parkes Foundation Board of Trustees, Ian Tom, Kathy Gray, Gillian Webber, Peter Webber and Di Barnes. Ian, Kathy and Gillian are all descendants of Henry Parkes, and we have a number of other descendants here in the audience with us tonight. I would also like to welcome members of the Old Parliament House Board, our Chair, Barry Cassidy, and our Deputy Chair, Bernard Wright. It is my great pleasure, though, to begin this evening by inviting Ngambri, Canberra and Ngunnawal custodian, Paul Girawa House, to the stage to provide a welcome to country.
Amandangu, Wurrugawurri, thank you very much, Stephanie, and Yari Marang, Burro Marambang Mayin Maranya. Good afternoon, everyone. Noi Goy Malang, Marambang Malang, Nina Nain Mura Buramba Bira Goyambana, Nina Nurumbango. It's beautiful, it's wonderful to be here on country at the Old Parliament House, Gujigang Ganya, Old Parliament House, to share this welcome to country with you all. Yuandu Paul Gerawa House, Nadu Maradu, Mare Beringo, Gujigango, Ngambri, Canberra, Nurumbango, Murunwaginya. I was born here at the centre of my ancestral country at the Old Canberra Hospital. God bless it. Anyone born in the Old Canberra Hospital? Oh, look at this. Well, it's great to see hospital alumni here this evening with us all. Giyalang is our identity, our belonging, and we all have a belonging. Yinjamara Bala, Mujigang, Henry Parkes, Mayin. I like to acknowledge the descendants of Henry Parkes and all the family and everyone here. Niaway Gunangijul is our identity, and we all have an identity, no matter who we are and where we come from. And I may share a little bit more about that, but Yilangalangbu, Wirai Nyang, Wirai Mayin, no language, no people. Wallawin Mayin, Wallawin Nurumbango, healthy people, healthy country. By the way, my second son was born in Parkes, and his middle name is Henry. George Henry, by the way. So we're all connected somehow. So Yilangalangbu, Gibabangu, Wogabo, Megabu, Diranil Bang Mayin. Ladies and gentlemen, young men, young women, distinguished guests, Ian Tom, wonderful to meet you, and the Board of Trustees, Stephanie Bull, wonderful to meet you as well tonight, and Barry Cassidy, Nyari Injamali, Ngambri, Canberra, Walgalu, Wallabaloa, Nunawa, Nagarigo, Wiradjuri, Mujigang, Yanambu, Jayandu. My respects to Ngambri, Canberra, Walgalu, Wallabaloa, Nunawa, Nagarigo, Wiradjuri, elders, past and present. Nyari Injamarabu, Mujigangu, Nurumbanjigu, Ninya Yeridu. My respects to all people from all parts of the country and elders from all parts of the country. Ngambri, Canberra, Walgalu, Wallabaloa, Mayin, Gaimbanya, Ninyoga, Nurumbanguldara. Ngambri, Canberra, Walgalu, Wallabaloa. People, welcome you all to country. Nadu Wurugabigi, Balabambo Gubu, Balagibang Gubu, Goanguliala, Dumbali, now Murway Marambo. We listen to the old people, the ancestors, the elders, and they show us the good path, the right path, the straight path. Goanguliala, Bilangali now, Yamamali now, Walamali now, they nurture us, they protect us, they help us, they guide us. Maramara Muru, creating pathways, Muruwaro, on track, Adulagang Muru, straight path. Mambo Wara Naminyago, Wuragabinya Wura Darego, winning Gala Go Baligo, looking to see, listening to hear, and learning to understand. Niani Injamali Nurabangila Balanin, Wallawin Galinga, Bangbo Yaringingo, Niani Mawang Yao Biligigila, Yamon Belgiriani, Marambo Bagrigan, Yaningingo. We respect country, we look after country so it is healthy for all our children, and we teach and we learn together what is right for all on country. Muran Waginya Yinjamara, Muramuru, Wirambira, Nurambango. Living a respectful way of life cares for country. Yinjamara, Wirambira, Marando Gobo, Gira Gobo, Yanda Gobo. Respect is taking responsibility for the now, the past, the present and the future. Maragaladal, Walan Mayan Mayangalang. We hold fast to each other, we empower the people. Walan Gunmala Mara Mara Gure, we be brave, we make change. Dira Yawana, Murawara, Nawan Bira. We get up, we stand up, and we show up. It's wonderful, we're all here. Like I said, our Welcome to Country is made in the spirit of peace and harmony and reconciliation for all people of modern Australia. And our main aim as local custodians always to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our right to declare our special place in the pre and post history of the Canberra region. The name Canberra is derived from the name of our people and country here, the Nyambri, the Canberra, Canberra. My great uncles were labourers here on this building, on the provisional old Parliament House. They lived and camped on Currajong Hill, right beside us here, but also on Russell Hill and Mount Pleasant. They came to work here barefooted and lived and worked on country and put their blood, sweat and tears into this democracy as opposed to democracy. We're talking about Australian democracy here. And we need to protect our democracy. We talk about that all the time. So mara mara, nya nya girma maranya. Respect shapes us and lifts up the people. Mara mara, winanga gigalana mayin. Respect creates people who care for each other. So noe goy malang, goyambana nino nurumbango. Welcome to country. Thank you very much. Before I go, I'm just going to play a song in the Yadaki.
Thank you, Paul, for your generous and warm welcome to country. These ancient lands where we gather today have been home to exchange, debate and community for millennia. For generations, First Nations peoples have come together in this region to engage and connect with each other. I offer my respects and thanks to the continuing welcome we receive from their communities, and I would like to acknowledge all First Nations people here with us today. It is so wonderful to see so many of you here tonight on site and also online to listen to the 2024 Henry Parkes Oration delivered by Barry Cassidy, Chair of the Old Parliament House Board. The Henry Parkes Foundation and MOAD have worked together since 2016 in what is a positive, collaborative and enduring partnership, one that MOAD is proud to be part of. Our two organisations share a vision to inspire all Australians to engage with and participate in our democracy. And we see this in action tonight. Events like the Oration invite audiences to listen, discuss and share big ideas. Australia is fortunate to have a robust and effective democracy, and it must be valued and protected. MOAD's work has never been more important to share the stories of our political history, our civic freedoms, fair elections, and democratic systems that are based on the rule of law. This work enables us to build understanding, encourage learning, and ultimately to foster a sense of agency and community. There is no doubt that MOAD's work is made stronger when we collaborate with others. We feel fortunate to continue our partnership with the Henry Parkes Foundation. And it is now my great pleasure to invite Ian Thom, Chair of the Foundation Board, to the stage to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. We too are proud to have that association with MOAD. It's just benefited us, and I'm sure both parties, quite a lot. Your team here have made life so easy for us to be able to turn up, and it's done. It's been really appreciated, so thank you to all of those that have been behind the scenes. It's great that we're also here because they built a new Parliament House up the hill. Now, this could have become a redundant place. It could have been knocked down. But no, now it's a living memorial to what has been in the past and the importance of democracy. And that's really a great thing that MOAD are doing. And there's a little bit of Henry still here, even though it was 30 years after he died that this building was made. Because downstairs in the Truth, Power and the Free Press is Henry's Albion Press that he hand-printed the newspapers on, his Empire newspaper. And alongside is a copy of an original 1851 newspaper. And we're particularly proud as well with the donations and helping to the MOAD that at the time that COVID struck, the buses stopped, the kids couldn't come. But we were able to fund a digital studio where with green screen and Zoom and the technology, the kids, no matter how far away, could just log on and capture what they'd missed out on. They couldn't get to Questacon now. Now, Paul, mate, brilliant. Thank you for such a respectful welcome. Your talents on the didgeridoo are amazing. But we certainly accept your invitation and to welcome, and certainly acknowledge your people. Also, like to acknowledge, while acknowledging people, we've had two of our previous orators join us for this occasion. Karen Middleton, who was here in 2016, and Mark Kenny in 2020. They've all stood and delivered their orations here. The Henry Parkes Foundation, we started from basically the idea came out of a family reunion we had in 1996, which was 100 years since Henry had died. And we realised that there was some potential and things was there. And with a lot of work behind the scenes of our early secretary, the late Jane Gray, she was able to, with networking and things, to put together people that would help us, the legal side, everything else, the accounting side. And we ended up with a trust deed. And we were very lucky to have our first patron, Gordon Samuels, Governor of New South Wales, who at that stage was using Henry's office in the Colonial Secretary's building to sign the trust deed on the desk. And also we've been so lucky because Dame Mari Bashir is currently our patron, and she used Henry's desk as her official office for 13 years. And the office still is basically decorated as it was when Henry was there, although I think they used a more comfortable chair for their normal work. The Parkes Foundation also, through the New South Wales Parliament, we've run primary school and secondary school conventions, which has been really good because we've put a topic out to schools, mainly the ones that were in Henry's electorate. He had several electorates, of course, over his political career. They would come in and debate, but only, say, 4 from the class, or 6th class normally, would come. But they'd get a question to talk about, whether it's constitution or whatever else was the topic of the time. They'd go home and they'd ask Mum. Mum would have to think about it. So we had this ripple effect of dropping the pebble in and it going out to the wider family to to discuss what they were going to present. Our orations are always around this time of year. 24th of October 1889, Henry gave his famous speech in Tenterfield. And hello to our friends in Tenterfield who are watching online, as to everyone else watching online. Tenterfield was really the birthplace of federation, or that idea, and here is where it was practiced for so long. We'd like to engage the public with these orations in understanding our constitution and our political systems, and these discussions do that. Oh, excuse me 1 minute, I did forget one thing to bring with me. These orations have been very successful, and we've ended up publishing up till 2014's in here. We launched the book in 2015 on 100 years of Henry's birth, 200 of Henry's birth. The Crimson Thread, that was one of the famous phrases of Henry's, the crimson thread of kinship runs through us all. So there's topics. We've had education, nursing, railways, journalism, democracy, social justice, a lot of those fields that Henry found important. And you can look them all up on parksfoundation.org.au. I encourage you to check that out. Now, I'm here, but I feel like I'm a fraud because my job is to introduce you to Barry Cassidy. Now, everyone knows Barry Cassidy. You've seen the face, you can recognise him anywhere. He couldn't go through a shopping centre and he wouldn't know. But anyhow, just for the record, he started writing a football column at his hometown in Chiltern in Victoria. And of course that's led to a whole newspaper journalism role, regional, metropolitan, radio, television, it's all there. Political correspondent, he's been to US and European correspondent, sorry about that. And press secretary to Bob Hawke. Well, if you wanted to hear both sides of what was involved, I think that was a seat you were really enjoying. But it's the 18 years of TV career on Insiders. You know, you've seen him there quietly asking the same question probably 3 times, and they always say, oh, I've answered your question, but they haven't answered the question, and he keeps persevering. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be having a mic in the middle, or raving mics. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen here, and when Barry's finished, he's quite prepared to take questions. Now, when he retired from television, a lot of good things were said about Barry, and I can see a similarity to Henry in some of these. Bill Shorten said, he's a true servant of Australian democracy. And like that, Henry had this big picture view of what should happen. And another one was, he was a champion of women behind the scenes. Henry struggled to get the women's suffrage vote. He couldn't convince his male-dominated parliamentary careers to agree with him. So, 135 years after Tenterfield, the 2024 Henry Parkes Oration, I asked the chairman of the board, Barry Cassidy, to tell us about defending Australia's democracy against global challenges. And as they say on television, over to you, Barry.
Well, thank you, Ian and Stephanie, and as always, Paul. So here I am addressing the Henry Parkes Foundation on democracy. I feel a bit like I've been invited by the Australian College of Surgeons to talk about heart bypasses. These guys know the topic. And we do congratulate you on your work in that area. Your foundation for 26 years now has not only honoured the role that Henry Parkes played in the creation of our democracy, but you've actively encouraged Australians to explore our political and our constitutional history. We thank you for that. Henry Parkes was the standout character in Australia's 19th century pre-Federation political history. No matter that he died 5 years before Federation, his work had been done. He'd been pushing to unite the colonies for 30 years before that, His work did culminate, as Ian mentioned, in the famous Tenterfield speech of 1889. That then led to a federal conference in 1890 and a constitutional convention in 1891. Now that's not a bad template. The vision, a conference, a convention, and then a result. It's kind of a template that I think that we could think about in the modern day. He was a remarkable character. He wasn't educated or skilled in the traditional sense, and he certainly wasn't a rich person. But he succeeded as a journalist and editor. He was a keen poet and an impressive orator. He had a powerful personality and a real knack for politics, so much so that he was the longest-serving Premier in New South Wales colonial period. Such was his political antenna that what did he do to promote the concept of federation when he visited Victoria in 1893? Well, he jumped in a carriage and he went to the Victoria Derby at Flemington. And that's the way politicians do it until this day in Melbourne. I think the great legacy is how seamless and peaceful was the transition to federation. He helped create a new and quite a dramatic political order, but embedded in strong democratic principles that have endured to this day. Principles effectively put together in just 6 weeks, and yet so much of it met the test of time. It might have been the journalist in him, but it was quite remarkable that unlike countries like Canada and the United States, he insisted that the media be allowed into the conventions, ensuring transparency, and I think that undoubtedly led to a better result. Some of his newspaper articles were informative in that respect. Consider he was a Premier and a politician himself, but he wrote this about the media's obligation. He said, "You must expose government corruption where it exists. Make the voices of complaint loud and general till the cause be removed." And then this, "Put away all fear and affection in the performance of it." And how relevant to today, and appeal to the media to be fearless and courageous, and don't let affections and familiarities hold you back. And that is sometimes difficult. Hidden in these columns too was some advice about how to handle constitutional change of any kind really. His message was really, don't rush it, prepare the soil. 2 decades out from federation, he noticed a slowing in the momentum. And he wrote, "Maybe it's best to let the idea mature in men's eyes, in men's minds." And it did, 20 years later, the nation was persuaded. There was one area, though, Ian, I think, where you'd have to give him a fail, and that's this. In 1849, he turned up a circular key to demonstrate against the transportation of convicts. Now, he was partly successful. The rates started to slow down, but the ships did arrive until 1868. And just as well, otherwise my family on both sides, the Cassidys and the McGanns, would never have made it to Australia. So now today I offer a report card on democracy here and around the world. And in short, grim in many places overseas and getting worse, yet much to be encouraged about here and much to watch out for. Thus the title of the oration, Defending Australia's Democracy Against Global Challenges. Because democracy is challenged everywhere, fragile almost everywhere. The world is in a democratic recession. The International Institute for Democracy, based in Stockholm, has, quite alarmingly, I think, reported that last year marked the 7th year in a row in countries with a semblance of democracy where those countries went backwards with a net decline, outnumbering those that advanced. The Institute found that decline reflected either flawed elections or that endured attacks on the freedom of expression or freedom of assembly. There are countries on the margins, countries struggling with cost of living and dealing with climate change and facing the reality of a tiny few growing obscenely rich, of forced population movement and wars like the invasion of Ukraine. So democracy is at its best stagnant in most places where it exists and declining in far too many other places. Autocracy, I think it's fair to say, and world leaders have said this, that autocracy is winning the fight against democracy. The World Economic Forum now lists just 27 fully functioning democracies, and that's in a world of more than 200 sovereign nations. 27 countries where citizens are encouraged to vote, and that is important, encouraged to vote, where those countries have broadly a free and independent judiciary and a free and independent media, the basic pillars of democracy. Now, at first blush, you'd think 2024 has been a standout year for democracies. We were told at the beginning of the year, guess what? Through this year, almost half the country, almost half the world, 4 billion people, are going to the polls, more than ever before. 49% of the world's population, 80 countries. But don't be misled by that. Just having an election and giving people a vote does not immediately translate to the best democratic values. It does not guarantee a full and fair election. In Bangladesh, for example, and I think that was the first election of the year, the Prime Minister won a fourth term, but there was no opposition. Because of persistent crackdowns on political dissent, the major opposition party boycotted the poll. In Pakistan, the election went ahead with the former PM, the champion cricketer Imran Khan, in jail, along with many of his supporters. A Swedish think tank ranks, on a scale of 1 to 10, countries and their commitment to democracy, in a sense. They have countries like Syria, Chad, South Sudan, rating a big fat 0. Bangladesh, Iran, Russia, not much higher. So simply put, proper democracy demands proper elections and so much more than that. So now we'll go to the United States, because that's, what are we, about 2 weeks away from the election. And the situation there is chronic in many senses. It's the biggest economy in the world, the one country that believes in its heart that they are the democracy standard bearer to the world, the country and its people that will profess a love for democracy without having any idea of how they have, by their actions, put all of that at risk. It came to an astonishing flashpoint on January the 6th, 2021. A mob in support of Donald Trump, and so many convinced in their own minds that the election had been stolen from them, stormed the Congress. They attacked the Capitol building, and it's worth reminding ourselves of what the intention was. They wanted to prevent the Congress from counting the Electoral College votes and so deny Joe Biden victory. It was, by any interpretation, an insurrection. People were killed, democracy denied, almost. And the former president was accused of either at best doing nothing to calm the mood of the mob, or at worst actively encouraging them. Well, more the latter, because ever since he has praised the perpetrators as heroes who will be released from jail if he's elected. But who saw this coming? Who imagined growing up that something like that would happen in the United States in our lifetimes? And that more than half the elected Republicans to this day declined to disavow the notion that the election was stolen, and still many of them will not say in advance that they'll necessarily accept the result of the next one. This is despite the fact that nowhere has any governing authority, any campaign audit, any judiciary found any evidence of malpractice that might have impacted on the result. You can only imagine the impact that that's having on, more broadly, on the trust that people in the United States are placing in their democratic processes. But it also points to just how deep was the resentment even before Trump gave voice to their frustrations and their prejudices. So many had lost faith in democracy already. They believe the system works against them and gives them no chance. And in a country where most of the country's wealth is in the hands of the top 5%, then that feeling of isolation and unfairness will fester. And when 70 million people, it seems, are rusted onto Trump, no matter what they might say in New York or Los Angeles, no matter what the courts find, then you get a sense of how deep that division is, and that surely will live on after Trump, even if he was to be defeated. He's the standard bearer now, the lightning rod, but if he's defeated, they won't change. That deep resentment will stay with them. Nick Bryant, who was a former BBC foreign correspondent and worked in the UK and the United States, and he's now here, He released a book called The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself. And he argues that Trump is merely a symptom of a country with massive unresolved issues. The unending internal conflict over issues like race and immigration, wealth distribution, gun control, cities versus country, abortion rights, they just go on and on. They are deep-seated and historical. And there's also the question, even before Trump, even before January 6, 2021, how democratic was the United States anyway? I mean, look at the Constitution and how power is distributed at elections. The House is democratic by most standards. The vote for the presidency, though, is starting to be questioned in a way, the electoral college system, because at the next election, the contest seems to be reduced to about 6 or 7 battleground states, and that's it. And what the rest of the country says won't really matter. But the real story is in the Senate, and the Senate is powerful. Each state has 2 senators, no matter the size of that state. So California, with a population of close to 40 million, has 2 senators. Wyoming, with 500,000, has 2 senators. Now, if you apply the principle of one vote, one value, strictly speaking, if you're going to give Wyoming 2 senators, you have to give California 160. They're 80 times bigger, and they've got 2. So is it any wonder that the Senate sometimes struggle, I think, to reflect the views of ordinary Americans? To put it another way, half the population of the United States is represented by 18 senators and the other half by 82. So increasingly the Democrats are the party of the cities and the Republicans are the party of the rest, and that's hardly world standard. The system is such that I've seen opinion polls that go as high as 70% of Americans saying they would like urgent and drastic reform to gun laws, but they won't get them. And that's because far more than half the senators live away from the big population centres, and they don't want changes, and neither do their constituents. And there's another aspect, I think, of their election that questions whether the United States is firmly and fully committed to democracy. And President Obama pointed to it in a speech in 2016 when he said that we, the United States, is the only advanced democracy in the world that deliberately discourages people from voting. They vote on a working Tuesday. The lines are notoriously long, unlike the lines here at Hull Parliament House. You can walk straight in. Maybe even more worrying, they don't have a central and a single electoral authority. The states have their own governing bodies. They set the rules, and even within the states, the rules can vary. And all that leads to a lack of faith in the system. And they don't have compulsory voting, and I'll come back to that. But Joe Biden has conceded that globally the argument for autocracies is growing. China, for example, finally embraced the open markets, but it resisted any movement towards democracy. A commitment to autocracy and communism is as strong as ever. They argue that under their system, they were able to drag the nation out of poverty. Joe Biden had a telephone conversation with President Xi earlier on in his presidency. President Xi actually argued directly to the American president that democracy doesn't work anymore. And he said to him, democracy, he says, requires consensus. And in a fast-moving world, consensus takes too long. And that is their genuine belief, at least the belief of the leadership, that their system gets things done, no matter that the citizens have no basic rights. And this from a country that will soon be the biggest economic power in the world. So how bad is it in the United States? Bad enough for the mainstream media to spend a lot of column inches raising the possibility of another civil war. Not a civil war like before, but maybe localised skirmishes, a sort of guerrilla tactic where they cause trouble, they go on attack and they vanish back into the community. They might even target individuals and judges and journalists and media figures, buildings like black churches and synagogues. These scenarios have been discussed widely in the media. A YouGov poll 2 years ago reported that 2 out of 5 Americans believe something like that could happen in the next 10 years. Off the back of that, a congressman from Iowa, a Republican congressman, Stephen King, which is a fitting name for a scary guy, but Stephen King said this. He said, folks keep talking about a civil war. Well, one side, my side, he said, one side have about 8 trillion bullets. The other side doesn't know which bathroom to use. Now, that's rather chilling when you get that sort of a comment from an elected lawmaker. But you'd imagine if democracy is to decline even further in the United States, it won't be as dramatic as all that. There remains civil control of the military, and that's an enormous safeguard against extreme events. Though civil control of the military is now being questioned by Donald Trump himself, he's talked about using the military to quash what he called the enemy within, and of course by that he means political enemies. And he also talked of considering using the military, deploy the military against the lunatic left on election day. He's got no right to do that, but apart from that, he interprets who the lunatic left are. And you really wouldn't want to be open to that interpretation. So now to Australia and how we're holding up here. Well, thankfully, we're not the United States, but Australia nevertheless has its challenges. There are pressure points here, and some of them are quite concerning. The federal government has set up an organisation across several departments called the Strengthening Democracy Task Force. And at one of their meetings, they asked one of the contributors from the United States, from Stanford University, Professor Larry Diamond, to have a look at the Australian situation and come back and address them. And he did that. And he said, this is how you should look at it here in Australia. He said, just consider that you've been to the GP and you've had a checkup, and the GP says you're in good, even robust health. However, there are some nasty viruses going around, misinformation, disinformation, polarisation, particularly in the media. There's a degree of distrust of politicians and the political process. And there's a powerful new transmission, social media and digital platforms. And that is going to test our immunity. We will need new remedies and new vaccines. Here in Australia, though, we do have important guardrails. Bruce Wolpe, a senior fellow at the US Study Centre, outlines the major ones in his book, Trump's Australia. The major one, the Australian Electoral Commission. We have a single authority that oversees all elections with consistent rules and regulations. There's a survey that is carried out every year within all the Commonwealth departments and agencies, a trust survey. 1,000 people voted, and the AEC came out on top, the most trusted government organisation in the country. 91% expressed satisfaction with their services. Yet go back to the voice referendum, the AEC came under attack. They were wrongly accused of changing the voting rules to favour the yes vote. They did not in any way. It was a deeply disturbing development, and you don't like to see those kind of attacks on institutions, particularly those that we should be most proud of. I voted in Richmond in Victoria, and I've never seen this before, but there was a guy there with pens, handing out pens. And he was telling people, use a pen, use one of these pens, because if you use the pencil, they'll just scrub it out, they'll erase it, and they'll alter your vote. And I just looked at the guy and, what do you say? A second guardrail is compulsory voting that I mentioned before. And often when I raise this, it sets off quite a debate. A lot of people don't support it for various reasons. But in my view, compulsory voting encourages people to engage at least once in the cycle. It surely encourages a lot of normally disengaged people to at least embrace some knowledge, some sense of how they'll vote and why their vote matters. It's more than a right. It should be seen, I think, as a civic duty. As a result, we get a participation rate in the mid to high 90s. In the United States, they struggle to get far above the half the population. I think in the UK recently it was 60%. So it means in the United States you can have just a little more than 25% of the population putting an individual in the White House. And you can see why Trump can emerge when he can count on 60 to 70 million rusted on supporters, no matter what. And a third guardrail is the political structure itself. The fact that basic government ministries emerge from the elected pool. And because they are elected, they are then accountable to the people. We still, though, have to do more to start restoring faith in democracy. A government-sponsored survey released earlier this year showed that 95% of Australians agree democracy is important, but only 59% agree democracy in Australia is working as it should. So there is some disillusionment. But it's not just the political process that disturbs people. The public service has let us down in some respects in recent times. Too willing to do the work of the government without question. The media also has a role to play and is not playing it in so many respects. The mainstream media these days is under extreme cost pressures. They're struggling with reach and relevance in the digital age. They downsize, they polarise to embrace a niche market. That's the business model. They try and do more with fewer journalists, and as a result you get fewer critical eyes, fewer people gathering the information, and yet paradoxically you get more people using that limited information to opine and comment. And social media, used properly, is a fantastic resource, but it can also be toxic and adversarial. It's the antithesis to harmony and social cohesion. They obsess about clicks and ratings ahead of a sober sharing of information. Social media, quite frankly, is where nuance and content and depth goes to die. And of course it is so vulnerable to the worst disinformation and misinformation. So I mentioned that the Strengthening Democracy Task Force is taking up the challenge, and where I and Stephanie and others have responsibility, as from the board of Vol Parliament House, which is now, of course, the Museum of Australian Democracy, we are very conscious of our role and our capabilities. The museum was set up to celebrate democracy and to educate Australians about democracy. Now it has an even wider task, and that is to sustain democracy. We have some wonderful hands-on exhibits. We do what we can in terms of public awareness campaigns around events like referendums, but sustaining democracy is what we do. That's the core of what we do. And the key to it, and the most important element, I guess, is education, and educating the future generations. We get 350,000 visitors a year, 1,400 guided tours, but I think the most important statistic is that we get 87,000 teachers and students through the building every year. We'd like to do more, but there's a long waiting list. And of course we reach so many more of them digitally right around the country. We have to sustain democracy. We have to find the money and the resources to do it. We can't have the next generation ignorant to what makes up the basic pillars of democracy. We don't want them disinterested. They need to be exposed and they need to be inspired. Abraham Lincoln said of democracy that it is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that were tried from time to time. So, just in closing, Australia is at one vulnerable and yet well placed. Partly because we got the basics right, Ian, right from the start. But there are a lot of things that are not quite right. We must, for example, find ways, I think, to be more open to reform and change. If we do, and we honestly and openly confront the pressure points and deal with them, and continue our best endeavours to take the next generation with us, then we can be the nation in a troubled and fractious world that sets the example, the best example of democracy anywhere. Thank you. And I'm happy to take some questions. I think there'll be a microphone going around.
Hi Barry, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Thanks for your lecture, very interesting. I'd like to ask questions picking up on the points you made about consensus taking a long time to achieve, and also ask a question about who we are as Australia and how at risk that is. And I'd like to share two anecdotes to question the idea of are we fair-minded. So recently we had pro-sheep exporters on the lawns of Parliament, and I had one pull me up and say, the only reason that this policy has come into place is because there are activists in the department. So there's this belief, there's this temptation to assume that it's some kind of conspiracy or opposing force, which is why things don't fall in our favour. And then the other anecdote I wanted to share was that activists on the left who I've spoken to, sort of sympathetic to causes like Lydia Thorpe's, have expressed to me that notions such as social cohesion they perceive to be representative of control. social cohesion as a concept in their minds doesn't exist to bring us together, but to make people comply. So I'd like to ask what your take on our position as Australians who are fair-minded is in light of some of those anecdotes.
Well, the first thing I'd say about social cohesion, borrowing from Churchill, I think it's the best system that we've tried. I think it's preferable to the alternatives. But sometimes if you want change, you have to go beyond that. And that's what protests are all about. Protests are legitimate, and they should be allowed to happen in a peaceful way. It wasn't me who suggested that consensus takes too long. That was President Xi. I would give consensus plenty of time to find its way through the political system. I think consensus falls down a bit in this country when we become too polarised, and political parties look for political advantage ahead of an outcome. That's kind of encouraged by the adversarial nature of it. Fairness, well, the person that you talk about, the pro-sheep person, was entitled to be out there and to be heard, just as those who worry about live sheep exports are entitled to go out there and protest as well, and they should be left alone, and provided they do it peacefully, they should be able to do that. But there are unfairnesses built into the system that we do need to look at, but I think they're more around some of the issues that really are starting to come to the centre of the political debate, thanks in part to the independents. But there are issues around how election campaigns are funded. I think that goes to the fairness issue. We should have a closer look at that and be quite tough on it. Truth in advertising is another one. It's a difficult one because you're dealing with the media, and some of them are resistant on that. The lobbyists and the interest groups have too much influence. Again, I think all these lead to putting unfair elements into the political system. Some of them, though, are being addressed, and hopefully in the next Parliament even more so.
You touched on the independents then, but I'd just like your take on whether you think the movement of, say, the Teals, minor parties, Greens, whatever, is strengthening or weakening democracy versus the two-party system, which has held sway for so long.
Yeah. As to whether it strengthens or weakens the system, I don't think that's so much the point. The point is that if the Teals emerge and if they get even stronger, that's just democracy doing its job. It's giving people who have had frustrations with the political system for too long, it's giving them another alternative. When I first came to Canberra in 1980, 90% of Australians voted for one of the two major parties. Now that number's down to 68%. So that tells you something about the major parties and the system. I was asked at the Menzies Institute a few weeks ago about this, and I said, well, if there's a problem, the answer is in your hands. The answer is in the hands of the major parties. If trend is happening and it continues to happen, the major parties have to address it. It is an irreversible trend right at the moment. I think we are in for a period of maybe a longish period of minority governments. And the major parties have got to learn, I think, from now on to deal with the minor parties. There's nothing new in any of this. The Liberal Party has had its problems in the past with the Democrats, and the Joe for Canberra probably cost them an election. Labor was knocked around for 15 or more years by the emergence of the DLP, and the Greens are now causing them some grief inside the Parliament and outside. So, look, there's something going on. Absolutely something really significant is going on in the electorate right now. And I think it's on the obligation of the parties to figure it out and what is happening. But some of those issues that I just talked about before are issues that the Teals are putting up. And if they do have the balance of power, or at least more influence than they have now, they're the kind of issues that they would probably demand of the government of the day. But it just seems to me the one straightforward calculation for the Teals will be, in the event of a hung parliament, which major party has the most seats. Like if the Teals were to say, if the coalition were to have more seats than Labor and they were to support the Labor Party, the Teals wouldn't exist in 3 years. I can assure you of that, because they do come from safe Liberal Party seats. But they would have an argument if Labor had more seats. It gets interesting if it's Labor plus the Greens have more seats than the coalition. I don't think they can use that calculation. So it's going to be a real test for them and where they stand. But it's look, I know that there seems to be this view around it. It's certainly pushed by elements of the press gallery that hung parliaments are a terrible thing. That's what we've got to avoid. I just don't sign up to that. I don't. I mean, I think if we had better outcomes from governments than we've had in recent years, maybe. But I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing at all. During Julie Gillard's time, more legislation got passed than at any other period in the last few decades. There's no reason why. You know, I spoke to some Labor voters who quite deliberately in Melbourne voted for the Teal candidate, even though they were Labor candidates, because they were safe Liberal seats, and they thought that was one way of ousting the coalition member. But more than that, I just detected from some of them that they enjoyed the experience. And that's a worry for Labor, quite frankly. But I think they did enjoy the experience, and the more they think about it now, they said, well, the other angle to this is there are a lot of disappointed Labor voters right now. They don't think that the government's doing enough for them. And it's the weird thing that on some of these issues, it's Teals who would push them more to where they're comfortable. So I mean, we shouldn't get panic about the prospect of a hung parliament. It could be a very interesting time politically. Just wait for the microphones.
Thank you, Barry. A very quick anecdote. My father was clerk of the Senate for many years. He favoured cross-bench senators. He favoured minor party and independent senators. He also noted that though they were favourable to outcomes and to adherence to procedures of the Senate, respect for the Senate, some of them showed unequalled respect in their time as minority senators. But above all, he saw to it that they had sufficient resources and facilities, office space, access to research, to additional staff as necessary, because the independents, the cross-chamber movers and others attracted more democratic interaction. They became magnets to the community. They had to work harder than the main party senators because they stood for issues of interest to the community, and they had to take representations and lobbying the community. They needed the resources, and as head of the Senate department, he saw that they got the resources they needed. One of the first acts of Prime Minister Albanese was to cut back on resources to independents and Teals. And that's a shame in terms of the institution of the departments of Parliament themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and the fact is with the independents, they've got to vote on everything. So they've got to get their heads around it, everything. And the major parties, certainly in the case of Labor, less so with the coalition, or at least allow conscience votes and things, but they're essentially following the leadership, they're following the ministry. And so members can come and go with very little knowledge of what they're actually voting on. Independents can't do that. They've got to get across, and especially when their vote is so important, it's going to determine the outcome. So they've got to get their head around a whole lot more than most members of parliament. And the only way to do that is to be well staffed. And so if you want good outcomes, then they really should get adequate staff. It was probably a bit short-sighted of Anthony Albanese at the time, with this election so close and the potential for a hung parliament. He probably should have been a little more generous to them at the time, but I don't think in the end that would sway the way they vote on issues. The staffing issue is an irritation to them. But you're absolutely right. They've got to be resourced to make the best possible decisions.
Evening, Barry. Thank you so much for your oration. You rightly stated in your speech how undemocratic the United States Senate is, comparing California to the remainder of the United States. As a Canberran, I would also argue that the Australian Senate is inherently undemocratic, that ACT gets 2 senators compared to, say, Tasmania, who, despite only having an extra 100,000 people to the ACT, gets 10 more senators. In the spirit of saying that there is reform needed in the Australian system, do you believe that the way that the Senate is consisted of should be on the table for reform?
Yeah, I think lots of things should be on the table for reform. The Senate here operates differently to the United States Senate, and it was set up with different intentions. But I take your point. It sometimes surprises me as to why the territories don't make more of a fuss about that. Probably because they think they'd be hitting their heads against the wall, because there's a bit of self-interest involved here. But yeah, it's not, strictly speaking, democratic to have that situation. So I agree with you, but I've never detected, I don't live in Canberra any longer, but I've never detected a particular push around that right at the moment. But your point is well made.
Thank you very much, Barry. It was a very interesting presentation. I want to ask you a question about values. I mean, politicians on all sides here in the US, everyone is talking about the values they're upholding, and we know that they're often more espoused values and values they live. I'd like to ask you, to what role you think values are actually playing a role in what our politicians do or what they should be doing when their parties originally espouse certain values?
Yeah. Look, in my experience, I've never seen a great deal of difference between values on most issues. And I just give politicians points for sincerity and effort, but there are issues that they won't tackle for all of the wrong reasons. I'll just give you one example on gambling advertising. Now, a committee came up with a decision that they wanted action on it. In fact, virtually wipe it out, because they saw no value in gambling advertising, especially when kids are exposed to it when they're just watching a football game. And Labor balked at that. And the reason was, and I think Bill Shorten said as much on Q&A, when he said that the television networks rely on that income and we can't afford to send them broke. And he wasn't necessarily signing up to that. He was just trying to explain, I think, why they took the position that they did. And there's also this argument that sporting codes would die without that revenue. Now, where are the values in that when you say that we're going to allow sports gambling to be promoted on free-to-air TV with kids watching, because to do otherwise would impact on the income the television networks get? I mean, really? I mean, you talk about values. I mean, that's an example of of just ignoring the basic values. And as for the sporting codes, well, it would have an impact, and it'd probably have a greater impact in New South Wales than anywhere else because of the history and the way that's formed. But New South Wales talk about poker machines, and they say, but there'd be no money for kids' sports. Well, how is it that kids play sport in Victoria and in South Australia and Western Australia? Because they didn't rely on it from the first place. So look, the values are another example, and I might sound like I'm picking on the Labor Party at the moment, but it's the one that's fresh in my mind. When the senator left, and the main argument against her was that she didn't give her loyalty first and foremost to the party. Now, the new British Prime Minister, one of the first things he said on election night itself, he said, "My first loyalty is to the people." And it must be. Every politician's loyalty must be first to those who elected them. And so to have strict rules around that, I think, is wrong. That people must have the ability to express themselves without getting booted out of the party or invited to leave. So I think conscience votes are important. So, yeah, I think the value system can go awry at times, absolutely. There's a couple up here.
Hi Barry, Karen Middleton from The Guardian and Insiders. Thanks again for that, by the way. I'm going to do the National Press Club trick and ask you 2 questions if I can, but they're related in my own defence. And the first one is about secrecy. You've worked on both sides of the political divide, the dark side for a Prime Minister and the light side in the media. And you've dealt with secrecy.
Another day, but
I may jest. You've dealt with secrecy. So I want to ask you what role you think secrecy is playing in our democracy in this country, because it feels like even though we've had a lot of talk of transparency, there is still a culture of secrecy. So I'm interested in what you think about that. And also you mentioned funding, and I'm interested to know what you think the impact of political donations are on our democratic system. The government is promising change, although we haven't seen that yet, and if we get it, it won't happen before the next election. So secrecy and political donations, what do they do to our democracy in Australia?
yeah, well, with political donations, you really don't know because we still don't have a proper understanding of where some of the money comes from. I think the Clive Palmer experience was evidence that it is just so wrong that somebody with bottomless pockets can do so much. You know, in the United States, they endlessly talk about who's raising the most money. I mean, Elon Musk could just give $500 million to Donald Trump tomorrow if he wanted to, and that would have a big impact in terms of the advertising they'd then be capable of doing. So, of course, it's a problem. On secrecy, I'm not as across it now that I'm not working in mainstream media, but it was a point of great frustration for very many years. You know, we do have, you know, mechanisms in place that supposedly allow journalists to dig deep, but it's so hard now to meet the requirements that governments demand for that. And you get documents back, and most of it's blacked out anyway. So it is a frustrating thing for journalists. It should be a frustrating matter for everybody. The politicians should hear about it because secrecy, you know what secrecy breeds. It breeds corruption. And so we should be... and just on that, the press club habit of 2 questions. You let the politicians off the hook. If you ask 2 questions, the politician then focuses on the one he's more comfortable with, and by the time you get around to the second one, it's gone. Sometimes he never answers it. So, no double-barrel questions. Yeah, and there was a link. I accept that. Yep. Can we get the microphone on? Should we?
Do you believe that the increasing importance of non-state actors represents a threat to democratic systems?
Non-state actors, what do you mean by that?
Especially in the Australian context, transnational corporations.
And the question was whether
do they represent a challenge to democratic systems?
Well, if you look at the outcomes of elections in the past. Yes, there are times when they do. But it's for the politicians to determine for themselves. I just wish, rather than rationalise sometimes in the way that they just do the right thing. And that's not necessarily the case on so many issues. I don't think Australia has the same problem. We hear a lot about Gina Rinehart and the influence that she might have. And, you know, it's more kind of imaginary in a sense than it is in reality, because I don't think she's pulling the strings necessarily. I don't see that really in the formation of policy, so I'm not as disturbed about it as some. So I don't think it's a top of mind issue, but I think it's something that is pervasive in the United States. Yep.
G'day Barry, thanks very much for that. 1980, you arrived to this building. I'm just really curious, given you're in the unique position that you worked in this building, and many of us have done the MOAD tour and we've seen the Prime Ministerial Office, the Prime Ministerial Suite, and that little box that you as Press Secretary must have been working in that was more likely to have an ashtray on the table than a computer. But you're in the unique position of having worked in this building and then worked up the hill, at least in the press gallery, if not in suites there. So I'd just be very keen just to hear your reflections on what design does for democracy, possibly leading from the question down the front about the number of staff that need to be accommodated in a building, for example. But what was it like working in this building?
Yeah, it was an extraordinary experience. I actually started here in the press gallery and then worked in the executive wing. And then when we went up onto the hill, I worked in the executive wing, and then later on came back to the press gallery. So I sort of had both experiences in both buildings. But this place was, it was just the access that we had to everything. And look, that was not necessarily a bad thing for the politicians. I think they themselves now see some of the value in easy access to one another and the opportunity to sort of catch up semi-socially at times just by wandering around the building. You know, the late Peter Bowers used to talk about this building having a pulse. And it was like that. You could walk into it and you could just sense if there was something happening because you could see people rushing around. You just sensed it, whereas up on the hill, you can't. I remember when I'd arrived here in the early 80s and I needed to go and see Bob Hawke, of all people, who was on the Shadow Ministry at the time. And he was, I think, Industrial Relations Shadow Minister. And I found out where he was, and I went in and I knocked on the door, nothing, walked in, and there was a staff member on the left in this very narrow broom cupboard-like office, and he was sitting at the end at a desk. He was Shadow Minister. It was quite extraordinary that that's how they operated back then. But these days, everything that's new that's invented just makes more work for people and more work for politicians, I think. But I love this building. I loved working here. It just had a very different atmosphere. It was better for democracy in a sense, but it couldn't have gone on any longer. It was just so crowded and something had to be done. And now the new building is what it is.
I might just ask one last question.
Yep.
I know the fellow with the third row has been trying to ask if they're going to bring a mic to you.
Thanks, Barry, for some really enlightening stuff about the elections, but I've got a really pragmatic question. I'm mostly retired, but I've been working at early voting and pre-poll I've done 10 elections the last 5 years and 8 as a manager. And I would deal with the pen guys and the biro guys and the sovereign citizens on a daily basis. As a keen observer of the process, do you have any suggestions for how to deal with them without getting too upset?
Yeah, look, it is a serious question in many respects because people who have to deal with this stuff, it's tough. It's really hard for them. Stephanie would be able to talk all day about some of the experiences that people had here when we were asked to contribute towards the referendum, and we just put it was a factually based presentation just to make people aware of the issues. And it's the stuff that comes back in the feedback is shocking. So, you know, I sympathise with you. I don't have any advice other than what you've done, and that is just suck it up and cop it. You're doing your bit for democracy, and if you have to go that extra mile, then you've got to do it. But thanks for doing it. Just one more here. Yeah, one more. One more, and we're spot on for time.
Thank you. A bit close to that, I think. We're back. Selena Webber, I'm a Parkes descendant, and one thing, knowing about Parkes when he came to Australia, it was a small place where he felt it didn't have to be like the UK and everything could be different. It's a chance to get in there and do things. I think coming back to, I've always been passionate about getting youth and younger generation involved in their community, and politics is your media, not just standing for a party. And I think I'm from New South Wales, so you've got your council elections, then state, and then federal. And more recently, a lot of our councils have been merged to make bigger councils. And what I've noticed is you lose a lot of people who normally stand for council because they can't afford to. As the councils get bigger, it becomes more party and party money. I wondered what your thoughts are, and councils are often where young people will stand and get involved and maybe even change their views. I wonder what your thoughts are. It was actually a Liberal politician who said to me that, and he's never stepped up to say this publicly, but that really there should be one level of our 3 tiers of political that are without party politics, that you stand, you might have views to one party, but you cannot stand on a party platform. And that would allow, I think, a lot more young people to stand, particularly women. I've gone from a small council to a huge area council, and the lack of women now standing and people who felt they could do something, and the disillusion that I've seen across our electorate and the decreasing of volunteering. I wonder what your thoughts are on having, when you've got these 3 tiers in many of our states of, what your thoughts on that is, and particularly getting younger generations involved.
Yeah. In my hometown, Indigo Shire in Victoria, the mayor was from my hometown of Chiltern. She was 23. So there are young people doing a lot. But I agree with you around it is the form of government that's closest to the people. By definition, it is. And it's interesting that now I think there's a real awareness at the local government level that independents are going to do better than the major parties. A friend of mine ran as a Labor candidate in the Bega Shire Council against an independent who was a Liberal until 3 months ago, or 6 months ago. The independent won. I think they appreciated that that's what people are looking for at the local government level. They don't want party politics to interfere in the kind of decisions that are taken at that level. So I think that's where we're starting to see a real revolution in the way that local government operates. Thank you.
I agree with you. Another round, please. Since I've got the microphone, I'm going to sneak in one more question. We've seen Australia with basically a 2-party system with Teals and bits and pieces coming in. Do you ever think America would be brave enough to have a 3rd or a 4th party?
Well, it's open to them. It's open to anybody to run as an independent or a third force. Remember, one of them got 20% of the vote right across the board, so it can happen. But no, I don't think so. Just as there's no temptation here either to have first past the post, it comes up occasionally. to change the voting system, but at the British election, Labor got 64% of the vote, 64% of the seats for 34% of the vote. So, you know, be careful what you wish for.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Educational, partly frightening as to what may happen over the other side of the world. That is a bit of a worry. And anyhow, look, I'm sorry about your convict ancestry there. It wasn't all Henry's fault. But I think we've recently had King Charles here, and I think, just to quote one of the things that he said, he reminded us that enduring power of democracy through this technological change is such a powerful thing that we've got to have an enduring power of democracy. And when Henry gave his speech at Tenterfield, how everything happens here, such a smooth changeover after an election. He's up at Tenterfield and he said, round about the time America federated, they had between 3 and 4 million people. And he just challenged the Australian population. He said, surely what the Americans did by war, we can do by peaceful means. And we're one of the few countries that have succeeded in doing that. The other thing, one of Henry's phrases or little quotes in the lead up to the Constitution, which he said that Australia's destiny should not be the sport of paltering politicians that are here today and gone tomorrow. And I think if Henry was here today, he'd probably saying that on a bigger worldwide picture, that we're really vulnerable to that sort of thing. You take the time frame, these guys are only here and then gone, but the damage they do sometimes is amazing. Now, Barry, what we've got here for you, just some thank yous. As I said, the Crimson Thread, our book of the first lot, you will be in the second version.
Right.
Thank you. That we're working on that now. Henry, you know, a lot of people know him, the bearded old bloke. You'll see a picture of him downstairs without a beard. Sir Henry Parkes, the Australian Colossus. Stephen Dando Collins from Tasmania wrote the book. It's an easy to read book, and there's a hell of a lot about the bloke in there. And then just finally, on 2015, when Henry was, 2015, 200 years of his death, we had a little medallion struck just for Henry. So there's one of those for you as well. So again, a great thank you. It's been a very successful event for Moad, and it's been a very successful event for the Henry Parkes Foundation. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian. Appreciate it.